The wind carried the scent of burning fuel across the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. It was February 20, 1945, just after sunrise, when the first Sherman Flamethrower Tank moved toward the mouth of a Japanese tunnel. The Marines who followed it were not entirely sure what they were about to unleash. Most of them had never seen a flamethrower mounted on a 30-ton steel machine. Within minutes, the island itself seemed to catch fire. The ground trembled beneath their boots. The sand, so dark it seemed to swallow light, made every movement slow. Japanese machine guns stitched the beach in thin horizontal lines of fire. It was the kind of killing zone that punished hesitation. The men of the 4th Marine Division had learned that the hard way the day before. Now they had something new to push back with, a weapon built to turn fortresses into ash. Tank 431, a modified M4A3 Sherman, rolled forward at a deliberate, almost ceremonial pace. Its flamethrower nozzle protruded from the hull like the mouth of a dragon. Behind it, riflemen crouched low, using its armored body as their only shield. "Keep moving," someone yelled over the rumble of engines. No one needed to repeat it. The tunnel ahead had already survived naval bombardment and aerial strikes. It was part of a honeycomb of underground defenses, Suribachi's masterpiece. Inside that maze, Japanese soldiers had been waiting for this moment for months, rehearsing exactly how to kill any tank foolish enough to get close. But what came out of the Sherman wasn't steel or shell. It was liquid fire. The gunner squeezed the trigger. In less than 2 seconds, a jet of burning napalm shot forward over 100 yards, a living rope of fire that wrapped itself around the entrance of the tunnel. The explosion of heat was so violent that the Marines felt it from 30 yards away. Sand fused into glass. The tunnel seemed to inhale flames. Then came the sound, like a freight train howling through a furnace, followed by silence. Men who had survived machine gun nests and mortar fire froze in place, stunned. The Japanese defenders, hidden in the darkness beneath the island, had believed their tunnels made them untouchable. For the first time, that belief cracked. The effect was immediate and psychological. In a single blast, the old equation of Iwo Jima shifted. Before, a single Japanese bunker could pin down an entire company. Now, one tank could neutralize that bunker in seconds. The Marines advanced behind the Dragon, emboldened by something they hadn't felt since the landing began: momentum. Sergeant Thomas Duplantis watched the flames pour from 431 and knew they had crossed a threshold. "This isn't a weapon," he muttered to a radio operator beside him. "It's an exorcism." The island was being burned of its ghosts, one tunnel at a time. But Iwo Jima was not just any island. Suribachi had built a labyrinth under their feet, 11 miles of tunnels, bunkers buried beneath hardened volcanic rock, connected firing points. The Japanese did not intend to win. They intended to kill as many Marines as possible before dying themselves. When the first flamethrower tank appeared, many defenders still believed they could outlast everything. The reality unfolded fast. The first blast killed dozens inside the tunnel. Those who weren't burned alive suffocated as fire devoured the oxygen. There was no countermeasure. No water, no escape. Some tried to flee through secondary exits, only to run straight into Marine rifle fire. Others chose to stay inside, choking on heat and smoke, clutching their rifles like prayers. On the surface, the Marines pushed deeper inland. For days they had fought for every inch, losing hundreds to machine gun fire that came from nowhere. Now they could burn that nowhere. Tank 431 fired again. Another tunnel mouth disappeared behind a curtain of flame. Overhead, smoke rose like a black flag. It wasn't just destruction. It was a message to the men above and below ground alike. A weapon had arrived that even the most disciplined soldiers feared. Officers on the radio spoke quickly, almost breathless. "It works," one captain said simply. "My God, it works." This wasn't the kind of fire that came and went like an artillery burst. This fire stuck. It clung to walls, to air, to human skin. Even those who didn't burn felt the heat through rock. The psychological rupture was immediate. Some Japanese soldiers stopped firing altogether. Others screamed inside the tunnels, audible through the vents. But for all the shock and power, the men who crewed those tanks weren't untouched. Inside the steel shell, temperatures climbed past unbearable. The gunner could smell scorched fabric from his own gloves. Every time he pulled the trigger, he knew he was turning living men into shadows on the wall. By mid-morning, 431 and its sister tanks had advanced farther inland than any previous armored unit since the landing. Marines marked their positions with bright flags so the tanks wouldn't accidentally torch friendlies. Overhead, aircraft flew lazy circles, their bombs now an afterthought. The real weapon was already on the ground. The Japanese counterattack never came that morning. For the first time, their defenders hesitated in their underground labyrinth. They could face artillery, they could face tanks, but they could not face fire. On the radio, one Marine lieutenant summed it up with a sentence no one forgot. They're not afraid of dying, but they're afraid of burning. The black sand of Iwo Jima still radiated heat long after the last burst of flame subsided. Smoke curled upward like a slow prayer. Marines advanced over glassy sand, past the warped remains of steel doors and blackened stone. No one cheered. They just moved forward, knowing something irreversible had begun. This was the day the island caught fire. This was the morning the war changed shape. Even before the first wave of Marines set foot on Iwo Jima, the battle had already been shaped, not by ships or planes, but by a man who understood how to weaponize the earth itself. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi had spent a year turning the island into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had faced in the Pacific. It was not meant to be defended. It was meant to consume. Kurabayashi walked the island with a small team in 1944, tracing the jagged spine of Mount Suribachi and the ridges that cut across the volcanic plateau. He ordered his engineers not to build a front line but to vanish underground. The beaches, he decided, would not be defended with desperate banzai charges. They would be bait. His real army would live beneath the ash. What emerged over the next months was a buried world. Nearly 11 miles of tunnels carved through solid rock, some wide enough for vehicles, some barely large enough to crawl through. There were interconnected chambers with steel doors, command bunkers, artillery positions dug so deep that bombs did little more than shake the dust loose. Each tunnel mouth was covered with reinforced concrete and black sand to blend perfectly with the island itself. To an approaching Marine, the landscape looked dead and still. In truth, it was alive with thousands of hidden soldiers. Kurabayashi's design broke every expectation the Americans carried from previous island assaults. They expected an enemy who would rush to the beaches and die in waves. Here, no one was rushing. The enemy waited. He positioned heavy machine guns and mortars in recessed murder holes, arranged so their fields of fire overlapped like a web. If one position fell, two others could still hit the same patch of ground, and all of them were connected underground, allowing defenders to vanish and reappear where least expected. Even if Marines took a trench, the men who once held it might already be emerging behind them. Every piece of the island was designed to make the invaders feel like they were standing still. No high ground was uncontested. No open field was truly empty. Kurabayashi's doctrine was brutally simple: kill 10 Americans before dying. He forbade mass banzai charges, believing they wasted lives. He told his officers, each man must fight to the end from his hole. We will inflict maximum casualties. The Americans will have to burn the island to take it. They took those words literally. By early 1945, nearly 21,000 Japanese troops, many of them naval personnel pressed into infantry duty, were living underground. Their supplies were cached in deep magazines safe from bombs. Their artillery was mounted on rails, allowing them to fire and retreat behind armored shutters. Ventilation shafts were disguised as rocks. Some bunkers were so deep they would later survive multiple direct naval hits. American aerial reconnaissance saw almost nothing. Pilots reported few visible defenses. Intelligence analysts warned the island was lightly fortified. They were wrong. In February, the Americans unleashed a 72-day bombing campaign and a 3-day naval barrage, one of the heaviest of the Pacific War. When the landing came, Marines expected craters and corpses. Instead, they walked into a silent beach. It felt almost easy. That was the trap. Suribachi had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were clogged with men and machines. When the first Sherman tanks and landing craft were committed, the island erupted. Machine guns opened from angles no map could predict. Mortars fell like hail. Entire units were caught in a crossfire that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Beneath their boots, the defenders moved through tunnels like water through pipes. A machine gun that fell silent wasn't destroyed. It had simply moved. A bunker cleared by grenades could be reoccupied minutes later by men emerging from a hidden door 50 meters away. Marines found themselves fighting the same position again and again, unsure if they had ever really taken it. It wasn't just military cunning, it was psychological warfare. American troops were trained to read terrain, to find lines of advance, cover, and kill zones. On Iwo Jima, the terrain lied to them. Every ridgeline was a trick. Every rock could hide a barrel. No position was safe, not even those behind the lines. Suribachi believed in precision, not spectacle. He knew the United States would take the island eventually, but his goal was to make that victory so costly it would scar the American war machine. If the enemy hesitated here, he reasoned, they might hesitate when they reached the home islands. This was not defense, it was deterrence. When American engineers landed, they were stunned to find that even their heaviest bombs had left most fortifications intact. Underground, the Japanese waited in cool chambers, sipping water, listening to the rumble overhead like distant thunder. They knew their enemy believed the island had been softened. They knew the real fight was yet to come. In the darkness, a soldier could hear the muffled footsteps of Marines passing above and imagine their confusion. It was like watching prey walk over a trapdoor. But Suribachi also knew something else. Time was not his ally. Supplies were finite. Reinforcements would never come. So he built the island to bleed the Americans fast before his own men starved or suffocated. If he couldn't win, he would make sure no one forgot how hard he made them pay. On the surface, Iwo Jima looked like an island. Beneath it, it was a weapon, a buried, breathing thing designed to kill. When the flamethrower tanks arrived on February 20, they did not just meet an enemy, they met a fortress. And that fortress was about to be set on fire from the inside out. The U.S. military had learned to trust its firepower. By 1945, the Pacific Campaign had become a relentless pattern: isolate an island, bomb it into rubble, then land overwhelming force. It worked on Tarawa. It worked on Saipan. It worked on Tinian. Firepower paved the way for infantry, but on Iwo Jima, the pattern broke. In the weeks leading up to the landing, American bombers had flown hundreds of sorties over the island. Waves of B-24 Liberators droned in from the Marianas, releasing thousands of pounds of explosives on an island barely 8 square miles wide. They cratered the runways, shattered surface structures, and filled after-action reports with confident words like neutralized and destroyed. Then came the Navy. Battleships like the USS Tennessee and USS Idaho rolled into firing positions offshore, their massive 14-inch guns thundering day after day. 3 days of near-continuous shelling reduced the beaches to churned black ash, or so it seemed. The truth sat just beneath the surface. Suribachi's fortress had gone underground. American bombs blasted the skin of the island, but its bones remained intact. Each tunnel had been dug deep enough to shrug off shockwaves. Ventilation shafts were positioned to deflect pressure. When bombs fell, Japanese soldiers simply sat in their chambers, waiting, drinking water from underground reservoirs. Marines would later describe their disbelief when they landed. "We thought nothing could have survived that," one recalled. "But they were waiting down there like we just rung their doorbell." Intelligence officers had relied on aerial reconnaissance, photographs of surface structures, visible trenches, known artillery sites. From above, the island looked empty. That emptiness was taken as proof of victory. No one realized it was proof of something worse. The Navy expected to crush resistance before the first landing craft hit the beach. But on D-Day morning the bombardment lifted, the sky cleared, and the beaches stayed silent. It was the silence of something unbroken. At 9:00 a.m. Marines hit the black sand. By 10:00 a.m., machine guns hidden in caves and recess positions opened fire from multiple angles. By noon, landing zones were chaos. Tanks bogged down in loose ash. Artillery fire came from nowhere visible. Every time the Americans thought they had silenced a gun, it came back minutes later from a slightly different angle. Commanders radioed the same question again and again. Why didn't the bombardment work? On battleships offshore, officers watched the smoke clear and saw bunkers still standing. Some artillery positions had survived direct naval hits. Gun ports closed with steel shutters during shelling and reopened afterward like nothing had happened. They realized, far too late, that they hadn't been bombing an enemy, they'd been bombing a shadow. The men inside those fortresses were not demoralized, they were rested. For weeks, the bombardment had been a distant thunderstorm. While the Americans believed they were softening the island, Suribachi's troops were memorizing their rhythms. Every day at the same hour the bombers came. Every evening they left. Underground, soldiers listened to the pattern and smiled. By the time the landing began, the Japanese had pre-sighted every approach path. They knew exactly where the Marines would step. When the ship stopped firing, it was like a curtain rising on a play they had rehearsed for a year. U.S. Marine commanders faced an unprecedented problem. Their artillery couldn't crush the defenses. Their naval guns couldn't uproot them. The Air Force couldn't dig deep enough to touch them. Iwo Jima was absorbing firepower like a sponge, and then spitting bullets back. Colonel Walter Weller, one of the officers studying early combat reports, described it bluntly. "We were fighting an enemy we couldn't see, inside a mountain we couldn't kill." The terrain made everything worse. Iwo Jima's volcanic ash wasn't like beach sand. It was loose, deep, and treacherous. Vehicles sank. Trenches collapsed. Smoke from naval bombardment hung low, blinding spotters. Marines trying to dig cover often found themselves knee-deep in shifting earth that swallowed shovels faster than they could dig. The Marines needed a way to reach inside the island, not just pound its shell. Artillery could not do that. Rifles could not do that. Even satchel charges barely scratched the surface. Every Japanese position had multiple exits, making it nearly impossible to seal off with conventional infantry tactics. Field commanders filed urgent after-action notes to higher headquarters. Enemy bunkers intact. Recommend development of close assault weapons. Current methods inadequate. The phrase close assault weapons was bureaucratic language for something simple. They needed a way to burn the enemy out of the ground. Marine infantry had used man-portable flamethrowers since 1943, but those tanks on a man's back lasted seconds and exposed the operator to near-certain death. On Iwo Jima, those men were slaughtered before they got close. What they needed was something armored, something that could deliver fire from a safe distance and not die doing it. Inside the staff rooms of the Pacific Fleet, the conversation shifted from artillery planning to engineering. If bombs couldn't break the island, perhaps fire could bleed it. Reports from earlier island campaigns, like Saipan and Tinian, showed that Japanese defenders feared flame more than shells. Shells could be endured. Fire suffocated, cooked, and crushed morale. A flamethrower didn't just kill, it collapsed the will to fight. At Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, a team of Seabees and Marine Ordnance engineers had already begun experimenting with converting standard Shermans into flame tanks. At first, it was a side project. After Iwo Jima's bombardment failure, it became a priority. A weapon was needed that could reach into the tunnels and burn them from the inside out, not just to kill, but to break the fortress Suribachi had built. By the end of that week, new orders were moving quietly across the Pacific. The next blow against Iwo Jima wouldn't come from the air. It would come from the belly of a tank. The birth of the most feared weapon on Iwo Jima didn't happen in a secret laboratory or a grand military facility. It happened on a sun-baked lot at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, under corrugated tin roofs, with welders in greasy coveralls and engineers who had more ingenuity than resources. The order came quietly in late 1944. The Marines needed a machine that could do what artillery couldn't: reach into the underground fortress, burn defenders out of their positions, and survive long enough to do it again. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about precision fire, endurance, and fear. The U.S. already had a workhorse, the M4 Sherman. It wasn't elegant, but it was reliable, roomy inside, and available in large numbers. If firepower couldn't crack the island, maybe fire itself could. So they turned to the men who built things that weren't supposed to exist, the Navy Seabees. The first step was to gut the tank's 75 gun. Where a cannon once sat, they planned to mount a flamethrower projector. Engineers scavenged from existing designs: the Ronson, the Navy Mark I, and experimental Navy POACWS units. None of them were designed for tanks at this scale, but they had one advantage: simplicity. The real heart of the weapon was the fuel system. Inside the hull, they installed massive pressure tanks filled with thickened napalm, a sticky, gasoline-based gel that clung to anything it touched. Under pressure, it could be fired in a jet more than 120 yards long. The flame didn't just flash, it crawled. Powerful pumps, modified from aircraft systems, forced the gel through an armored hose up to the projector at the front. To ignite it, engineers mounted a small auxiliary flamethrower nozzle beneath the main barrel. When triggered, it created a pilot flame. The main jet followed, turning the tank into a dragon. The system weighed more than the original gun. The balance of the turret had to be recalculated, reinforced. It wasn't elegant, but the crews didn't need elegant. They needed something that would burn through steel doors, kill oxygen in tunnels, and terrify men hiding in the dark. The Hawaiian sun beat down on the welders as they cut and sealed metal. Engineers tested pump cycles late into the night. They were creating something the manuals didn't cover. A few officers looked at the flame range charts and shook their heads. "If this thing works," one of them said, "it's going to rewrite the playbook." Testing began in December. At a small range carved into a ridge, a prototype Sherman roared to life. The projector fired, and a stream of burning napalm shot forward like a living rope. The flame reached 130 yards, farther than anyone expected. The heat was felt nearly half a football field away. Witnesses remembered the silence after the first burst. No one cheered. Everyone understood what this meant. They had built a weapon that didn't just kill, it erased. But there were problems. The first tests overheated the pump. Napalm ignited unevenly, leaving thick burning puddles near the tank. A faulty seal caused one burst to ignite too close to the hull, scorching the paint. Seabees responded the way they always did. They fixed it with what they had: reinforced valves, thicker gaskets, a protective armored cowling for the nozzle. Each failure became a footnote in a brutal learning curve. The fuel system could deliver around 500 gallons, enough for multiple bursts in a single engagement. Each burst lasted only seconds, but those seconds changed everything on the receiving end. A single tank could clear a tunnel entrance in less than a minute. What impressed the Marines wasn't just range, it was controllability. The operator could fire short, sharp bursts or sustained streams, sweeping an area with surgical cruelty. One engineer noted in a test log, a single tank could replace 3 infantry flamethrower teams with exponentially higher survival rates. Tank crews were carefully selected. They needed men who were calm under pressure. Operating a flamethrower tank wasn't like gunning a Sherman. It was hotter, riskier, more claustrophobic. A hit on the fuel system could turn the tank into a rolling funeral pyre, but the crews volunteered anyway. They understood what this weapon could mean. By January 1945, the CBH-1, short for Composite WWII Prototype 1, was operational. 8 Sherman M4A3 tanks were converted in total. They bore no special insignia, no experimental paint. Outwardly, they looked like ordinary Shermans. Inwardly, they were monsters. The Navy kept their existence quiet. Officially, they were POACWS H-1 flamethrower tanks, Pacific Ocean Area, Chemical Warfare Service. Unofficially, they were simply called Zippos, after the lighter that inspired the ignition system. As final tests wrapped up, tank crews drilled on coordination with infantry. The plan was simple but brutal. The flamethrower tank would approach a suspected tunnel or bunker entrance under covering fire. At close range, it would unleash a burst of napalm. Infantry would then move in to finish what the fire started. The doctrine became known as corkscrew and burn. It would define the rest of the Pacific War. In early February, the tanks were loaded onto LSDs, landing ship, tank for transport to Iwo Jima. Each crew inspected their machines with ritual care. They understood that the Japanese defenders had prepared for everything, except this. Sergeant Thomas Duplantis, who would later command Tank 431, scribbled in his notebook before departure, "They think they're safe in the dark. We're bringing them the sun." As the ships left Pearl Harbor, the Pacific stretched quiet and endless. The men didn't know the island they were heading toward would become one of the most violent battlegrounds in American history. But their weapons were ready. The CBH-1 flamethrower tank was no longer an experiment. It was a promise. The horizon off Iwo Jima was gray with smoke and spray. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the invasion fleet stretched from end to end like a floating city. Battleships boomed offshore. Landing craft churned toward the black beaches. The sea itself seemed to tremble. Among the thousands of men packed into those boats were the crews of 8 modified Sherman tanks, machines unlike any the Pacific had ever seen. Their official name, POACWS H-1, meant little to the men aboard. They called them Zippos, 8 steel dragons, each with enough napalm inside to set the earth on fire. Sergeant Thomas Duplantis sat inside Tank 431, sweating in the stale air of the crew compartment. The engine's vibration ran through the soles of his boots. He checked the projector assembly one more time, feeling the smooth curve of the nozzle like a mechanic caressing a heart he had built himself. Overhead, the coxswain of the landing craft barked orders through the wind. 2 minutes out. They'd been told to expect a slaughter on the beach, but no one told them it would look like this. Iwo Jima didn't look like a tropical island. It looked like a black wound in the ocean, volcanic ash instead of sand, cliffs instead of palm trees, no greenery anywhere. The landing zone was soft, shifting, like stepping into powder. Vehicles bogged down within seconds. Marines waded ashore under a silence so unnatural it made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. No one fired. It was a silence Suribachi had built deliberately, and at 10:00 a.m. that silence ended. Japanese artillery opened up all at once, like a single breath held too long. Mortars, machine guns, and 120 guns roared out of invisible mouths in the hillside. Marines fell in lines. Landing craft exploded. The soft black sand became a killing floor. Tank 431 ground its treads forward off the ramp. instantly sinking halfway into the ash. The driver cursed and shifted gear, fighting for traction. Above the roar of engines came the sharp, metallic ping of enemy rounds. The first machine gun burst bounced off the hull with a sound like hail on steel. "Keep her moving," Duplantis yelled. The crew obeyed with practiced calm. They had drilled for this moment for weeks. This was what the weapon had been built for. By afternoon, the Zippos had fought their way up from the beach, yard by yard. They advanced slower than infantry but drew more fire than anything else on the field. The Japanese recognized a tank immediately. What they didn't recognize, yet, was what these tanks could do. A bunker on the right flank spat fire and death into a marine company pinned behind cratered sandbags. Attempts to flank it had failed. Satchel charges bounced off the reinforced entrance. A portable flamethrower team tried to advance, only to be cut down before they got within range. Duplantis got the call over the radio. 431, clear that nest. The tank rumbled forward, treads chewing into ash. The gunner stared through his periscope at a dark rectangle in the hillside, a tunnel entrance. Machine gun fire clattered harmlessly against the frontal armor. "Range 80 yards, he muttered. "I've got it." Duplantis didn't need to speak. The trigger depressed with a soft mechanical click. The projector roared. A jet of burning napalm shot from the Sherman's mouth, arcing through the air like a ribbon of living fire. It struck the tunnel entrance dead center, flowing inward, wrapping the opening like liquid sunlight. The heat hit the Marines behind the tank like the breath of a furnace. Inside, Japanese defenders screamed, a sound most Marines had never heard before, raw and human and brief. The flame followed the air inside the tunnel, crawling downward like a predator. The ammunition inside began to cook off, erupting in a rolling blast that shattered the bunker's steel shutters. Black smoke billowed out. The machine gun went silent. Marines surged forward behind the tank, seizing ground that hours earlier had seemed untouchable. It was the first successful breach of a hardened bunker that day. Word spread quickly along the line. "The Zippos work," someone shouted over the radio. "They work." The Japanese defenders were disciplined, but they were human. Inside their tunnels, the temperature spiked, the oxygen vanished, and the sense of invincibility cracked. They'd spent months believing the underground fortress would shield them from everything. Fire had never been part of their calculations. Duplantis's tank advanced again, hitting a second entrance with a short, controlled burst. The flame stuck to the walls, rolled like a tide, then vanished into the dark. The enemy fell silent again. One Marine captain, crouching in the ash, watched the scene unfold and muttered, "Jesus, it's like watching hell open up." But the battle wasn't one-sided. The Japanese adapted fast. As the tanks approached, mortar fire shifted to hit them directly. Anti-tank guns hidden in recessed caves opened up at point-blank range. A single well-placed round could ignite the fuel tanks, turning a Zippo into a fireball. Tank 431 took a near miss on its right flank. Shrapnel rang against the hull like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, the crew gritted their teeth but held course. They had trained for this. Every inch forward mattered. By nightfall, the Marines held only a narrow strip of beachhead, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time since the invasion began, they had a weapon that could break the myth of invulnerability. The Japanese defenders had prepared for artillery, shells, and bullets. They had not prepared for fire that crawled through their tunnels and took the air from their lungs. That night under a red sky, Duplantis sat on the hull of his tank, exhausted. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. The smell of scorched earth lingered like a second atmosphere. In the distance, Suribachi loomed like a shadow against the stars. He didn't celebrate. None of them did. They had seen what the weapon could do and what it required to use it, but they all understood the same thing: the fortress could bleed. The beasts had landed. The first day the flamethrower tanks landed, they cleared a handful of tunnels. The second day, they changed the entire tempo of the war. Before February 20th, 1945, every advance on Iwo Jima was a grinding push against invisible machine guns. Marines were forced to crawl forward through loose volcanic ash, throwing grenades into openings they couldn't see, losing men to bunkers that simply came back to life minutes later. Progress was measured in feet. But once the Zippos rolled inland, something subtle, but enormous shifted. Instead of fighting the same bunkers 3, 4, or 5 times, the Marines could burn them out once. Fire didn't just destroy defenses, it hollowed them out. The first reports filtered up to division headquarters by the end of the second day. Flamethrower tanks extremely effective against pillboxes and tunnels. One after-action note read, "Recommend priority use in all assaults." On the ground, the doctrine adapted faster than any memo could travel. The infantry learned to move with the tanks, not behind them. Each Zippo became a spear tip, a slow, smoking, terrifying machine that led assaults into positions artillery couldn't touch. Riflemen followed in its shadow, close enough to avoid flanking fire but far enough to escape the backblast of the flame. It wasn't elegant, it didn't need to be. The Japanese defenses were designed to withstand bombardment. They were never meant to withstand fire that could pour down tunnel throats and eat the air itself. Inside those bunkers, soldiers who had prepared for death by gunfire suddenly faced something far more primal. Survivors described the sound, a roaring liquid thunder followed by silence. The firestorm didn't just kill, it erased options. There was no retreat, no counterattack, no glorious banzai charge. There was only smoke and heat. Marine assault teams began to use a rhythm the men called corkscrew and burn. Engineers would locate a tunnel entrance, mark it with colored flags, and call forward a Zippo. The tank would approach slowly, under cover from riflemen and supporting Shermans with regular 75 guns. At close range, sometimes as near as 30 yards, the gunner would squeeze the trigger. Fire would roar down the hole. Infantry would advance behind the smoke, secure the position, and seal the entrance. This rhythm repeated across the island like the beat of a war drum. At Hill 362, a single flamethrower tank cleared a fortified position in less than 3 minutes, a position that had held off 2 infantry companies for half a day. At the quarry, 2 tanks turned a maze of interconnected tunnels into a collapsed furnace. The reports were clinical. The reality was anything but. From the Japanese perspective, it felt like the earth itself had turned against them. Suribachi's fortress was built to neutralize bombs and bullets. Fire crept through its veins. Ventilation shafts, once a clever defense, now became death traps as flame and smoke surged upward through them, incinerating anyone trying to breathe. Many defenders didn't even die from burns. They died gasping for air in sealed chambers, their oxygen devoured in seconds. Those who survived often emerged disoriented, coughing, and blind, easy targets for the Marines who followed behind the tanks. Psychological warfare had arrived uninvited. One Marine sergeant recalled watching a group of Japanese soldiers flee from their own tunnel, something unheard of during the opening days of the invasion. They never ran, he said, until the fire came. For the tank crews, the transformation was both empowering and terrifying. They became the centerpiece of every assault. Where they went, the line advanced. But that also made them targets. Every Japanese anti-tank gun, every mortar tube, and every suicidal infantryman with explosives shifted priority to them. If the Zippos were the spearhead, the enemy aimed for the spear. Tank 431 came under constant fire. Mortars bracketed their movements, trying to collapse the ash around them. Sappers tried to crawl close with satchel charges, but the supporting infantry, now trained to defend the tanks as if defending their own lungs, cut them down. The bond between tank crew and riflemen hardened into something personal. Without the tanks, the infantry bled. Without the infantry, the tanks burned. Commanders noticed the numbers. Positions that once cost dozens of lives to take now fell in minutes. Casualty rates around flamethrower tank operations were significantly lower for Marines, not because the fight was easy, but because the enemy broke faster. Fire cracked what bullets could not. Suribachi's officers responded with ferocity. They repositioned artillery, dug emergency escape shafts, and tried to ambush tanks in narrow gullies. A few succeeded. Zippo 435 took a direct hit from a concealed gun, igniting its own fuel and killing the crew instantly. The explosion lit the night sky like a second sunrise. Every tank crew that saw it knew the risk they carried in their bellies. And yet they kept advancing. By February 23rd, 3 days after the tanks first landed, the U.S. assault looked different than the one planned in briefing rooms. Instead of relying on massed infantry, company after company was built around the movement of a single fire-spewing tank. Infantry formed wings. Artillery adjusted to support the fire corridor. Engineers followed behind, sealing tunnel mouths with explosives. The entire battlefield bent around the roar of the Zippos. Marine commanders began speaking less about terrain and more about targets for flame. For the first time, victory on Iwo Jima felt less like grinding against a wall and more like burning through it. But this new kind of war had a cost. The men who operated those tanks could feel every pulse of fire in their bones. Inside the steel shell, the temperature climbed past 120 degrees. The smell of napalm bled into their uniforms. When they pulled the trigger, they didn't just imagine what was happening inside those tunnels, they heard it. The screaming, the sudden silence, and then nothing. One gunner wrote in his notebook, "It's like being God with a match in your hand, and there's nothing holy about it." Outside, the Japanese soldiers began to whisper among themselves about the tanks. Stories grew like weeds in the dark: fire demons, American dragons, machines that breathed hell. Fear became a weapon no one had planned but everyone used. This was no longer the same battle that began on the Black Sands. This was a new kind of war. And both sides felt it in their bones. To the men of the 4th Marine Division, Hill 382 wasn't just a topographical feature. It was a nightmare. Rising out of the northern plateau of Iwo Jima like a jagged black tooth, it was the highest point in the central sector, and the linchpin of Suribachi's defense. Beneath its surface lay a honeycomb of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery nests. It was the beating heart of the Japanese fortress. The Marines called it the meat grinder. By late February, after days of brutal fighting on the beaches and at the airfield, the assault shifted toward this hill. Commanders knew that as long as Hill 382 remained in Japanese hands, the advance north would bleed itself dry. The Japanese could fire down on every approach route, reinforce neighboring positions through underground galleries, and coordinate counterattacks like veins feeding a heart. That made it the natural target for the Zippos. Tank 431 was among the 5 operational flamethrower Shermans assigned to the assault. Its crew had survived the landings and several bunker-clearing missions. Now they were heading into a position unlike anything they'd faced before. The hill didn't rise gently. It bristled with jagged rocks and concrete casemates disguised as boulders. Smoke from days of shelling hung low, turning everything into a gray blur. The Marines couldn't see the defenders, but the defenders could see them. Japanese gunners had pre-sighted every inch of the approach. The first wave moved under cover of artillery. Standard Shermans led the way, pounding suspected positions with high-explosive shells. Zippos followed in tight formation, flanked by riflemen hugging the ash. Mortars cracked overhead. Shrapnel rattled off the tanks like hail on a tin roof. "Keep her steady," Duplantis muttered inside 431, sweat already running down his face. The air inside the tank was a furnace. The flamethrower system didn't forgive hesitation. It was a weapon that demanded you move forward or die where you stood. Halfway up the slope, the first Zippo was hit. A well-hidden 47 anti-tank gun punched through its right sponson. Fuel ignited instantly. The explosion was so violent it ripped the turret off. The blast rolled down the hill like thunder. For a moment, the entire line froze. "Keep moving," the radio barked. "Do not stop, do not bunch up." The remaining 4 tanks fanned out, the infantry keeping pace as best they could. They had trained for this. Hill 382 was not going to be taken by courage alone. It was going to be taken by fire. Duplantis sighted a recess bunker halfway up the hill, smoke trickling from a narrow slit. "Range 60, the gunner called. "Burn it." The projector roared. A stream of napalm slammed into the slit, flooding the interior. The bunker's machine gun went silent. A secondary blast followed as stored ammunition cooked off. Marines advanced behind the fire like shadows chasing light. But for every bunker burned, 2 more seemed to open. The Japanese defenders had built depth into their defenses. Each tunnel had multiple exits. Flamethrower bursts could clear an entrance, but unless the tunnel was sealed, defenders simply circled through the underground and reoccupied positions minutes later. "We're burning the same hole twice," one infantryman growled as they cleared a trench for the 3rd time. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of how hard the hill fought back. Suribachi's gunners switched tactics. Instead of firing directly at the tanks, they aimed at the ash beneath them, trying to collapse the soft ground and trap the Zippos in place. A stuck flamethrower tank was a death sentence. Crews pushed their engines to the limit, forcing their 30-ton beasts up slopes that felt like quicksand. 431 hit a patch of loose ash and lurched to a stop. Mortars bracketed them instantly. "Back, back," Duplantis yelled. The driver slammed the transmission. Tread screamed. The tank shuddered loose just as a mortar round landed where it had been. A second later, the crater filled with flame as their own burst ignited spilled napalm. Marines swarmed around the tank, laying covering fire. The bond between infantry and tank had become instinctive. Each trusted the other's survival. 3 hours into the assault, the hill still stood. The air smelled of scorched earth, cordite, and burning oil. Zippo crews were running low on fuel. Standard Shermans were burning through their HE rounds at a staggering pace, and the Japanese defenders showed no sign of breaking. Then came the turning point. On the northern face of the hill, engineers located a major ventilation shaft, one of the arteries feeding the fortress below. If they could pump fire into it, the entire tunnel complex could be suffocated in one stroke. Tank 431 rolled into position, its hull scarred and blackened. "This is it," Duplantis said. The gunner lined up on the shaft. Infantry hunkered down, waiting. The burst was longer than usual. Napalm surged into the shaft like liquid fury. Within seconds, smoke erupted from other openings across the hill, proof that the tunnels were all connected. The heat wave was so intense Marines could feel it from 50 yards away. Inside, defenders suffocated in silence. That broke the back of the position. One by one, machine guns fell quiet. Counterattacks sputtered out. Marines surged forward, sealing entrances with satchel charges and bulldozing ash into the shafts. Hill 382 fell, but it didn't fall easy. Of the 5 Zippos that started the assault, 2 were burning wrecks by nightfall. 43 Marines were dead. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay buried underground, most never seen by the men who killed them. Duplantis sat on his tank after the battle, watching smoke curl upward from the hill like a dying breath. "That wasn't a fight," one corporal muttered beside him. "That was an exorcism." The flamethrower tanks had done what nothing else could, but the hill had shown their limits. Fire could clear tunnels. It couldn't hold them. It could kill, but it couldn't stop a determined defender from finding another hole to fight from. And yet, for the first time since the landing, the Marines held the high ground in the center of the island. The heart of the fortress was cracked. But the cost whispered a warning. The deeper the fortress, the harder it would be to burn it out. By the third week of the invasion, Iwo Jima no longer looked like an island. It looked like the surface of another planet, scorched, pocked, and flattened by fire and steel. The black volcanic ash was soaked with rain, fuel, and blood. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. Nothing moved without being watched. Nothing lived on the surface for long. The shock of the first flamethrower strikes had faded. Suribachi's men no longer believed they were invincible, but neither side had any illusions left about quick victories. This was attrition now, a contest of exhaustion, where every yard of ground was bought with sweat, fear, and fire. By March 10, the once cohesive Japanese defensive network was reduced to isolated tunnel clusters, but those clusters fought like wounded animals. Without clear front lines, combat became a series of brutal micro-battles. A single tunnel might take hours, sometimes days, to reduce. Marines began calling the central sector of the island the meat grinder. It wasn't a nickname for a single place anymore. It described the entire war. The flamethrower tanks, once the sharp spear tip of the assault, were now the grinding gears keeping the advance alive. Tank 431 and the surviving Zippos had adapted their tactics. The early frontal assaults had proven too costly. Now the tanks worked indirectly, firing into ventilation shafts, side tunnels, and natural fissures in the terrain. Instead of facing bunkers head-on, they turned the island's breathing holes into its own death traps. One tank would fire a short burst into a shaft. The napalm would roll downward like molten metal, filling hidden chambers. The pressure wave carried the heat deep into the rock. Moments later, secondary smoke vents would erupt black plumes, a silent confirmation that the defenders inside were either dead or gasping their last. Infantry moved behind the tanks in practiced formations. Engineers followed with explosives to seal the entrances. By this point, they no longer called it corkscrew and burn. It was simply the way we fight. But the Japanese adapted too. They learned to relocate artillery overnight, popping up in new firing positions with maddening unpredictability. Sappers dug emergency exits behind the main lines, launching ambushes the moment the tanks moved on. Their courage was as relentless as it was doomed. On March 14, 431 rolled into a gully south of Kitano Point to clear a series of tunnel mouths that had been firing on a marine company all morning. The approach was narrow, barely wider than the tank itself. Riflemen flanked along the edges, their faces gray with ash. "Watch your right," Duplantis muttered. He could feel the tension through the steel. They all could. The projector fired into the first opening. A clean burst. Black smoke followed. Then, from an unseen tunnel on their flank, a mortar shell arced in and exploded just short of the tank. The shock rattled through the hull like a hammer blow. Shrapnel rang off the armor. Over the intercom, someone cursed. The Japanese had learned to bait the Zippos. Fire into one hole, strike from another. It was a deadly dance, and every mistake cost lives. Marines surged in to flank the ambush. The firefight was short and close, too close for comfort. When the smoke cleared, 431 had survived. But 2 riflemen were dead, cut down in the crossfire. Duplantis stared through his periscope at the charred entrance and muttered the line everyone on Iwo Jima eventually learned to say without emotion. "One more hole down." This was the rhythm of the meat grinder. No grand assaults, no cinematic breakthroughs, just hours of crawling, burning, sealing, and moving on. And underneath it all, something quieter, psychological erosion. For the Japanese soldiers underground, the flamethrower tanks became a constant, inescapable presence. Even when they couldn't see them, they could hear them. The distant rumble of treads, the hiss of pumps pressurizing napalm, the whoosh of flame. Some defenders began firing blindly at night, convinced the tanks were approaching when they were. They were trapped in darkness, hunted by a weapon they couldn't outfight. For the Marines, the toll was different. They had to keep pressing forward through a landscape where death came from beneath their feet. The tanks were their shield, but the crews inside them carried a unique burden. Every burst of napalm meant someone, somewhere underground, was burning alive. Tank crewman Corporal James Feldman scribbled in his journal after a long day clearing tunnels near the Northeast Plateau. "It's not a war down here. It's extermination. We're burning ghosts out of holes, and they keep coming." Attrition didn't just kill men, it ate morale. By mid-March, tank crews were rotating between combat and repair nearly every day. The ash clogged engines. Fuel lines cracked from constant use. The flamethrower systems weren't built for continuous operations on this scale. Maintenance crews worked under floodlights at night, scraping napalm residue from pipes and replacing seals while artillery echoed in the distance. The Japanese, for their part, showed no sign of surrendering. Suribachi's strict orders against mass banzai charges meant the defenders stayed disciplined, striking from the dark until they were buried alive. By this stage of the battle, surrender was almost non-existent. Nearly every fight ended the same way: silence and smoke. The Zippos were still the hammer of the offensive, but they were no longer a shock weapon. They had become an industrial tool for killing, used methodically, almost mechanically. There was no glory in it, only necessity. March 21 would bring the largest single concentration of flame weapons on the island, the Bloody Gorge Assault. But in the long, gray days leading up to it, the Marines learned the hardest lesson of Iwo Jima. Fire could kill anything, but it couldn't make the island give up. At night, 431 idled near the marine perimeter, its hull scorched black from dozens of bursts. Duplantis sat on the tank's glacis plate with his helmet in his hands, listening to the distant shelling. Around him, men smoked in silence. No one talked about the next day's objectives. Everyone already knew what it meant. The meat grinder didn't care about plans. It just kept turning. By the morning of March 21, 1945, Iwo Jima had become a wound that refused to close. The Marines had pushed steadily north, burning and blasting through fortifications one tunnel at a time. But ahead of them lay one last major stronghold, a ravine the men called the Gorge. On the maps, it had no name. To the Japanese defenders, it was simply another node in Suribachi's underground network. To the Marines, it would become the single most violent engagement of the entire campaign. The gorge cut across the northern plateau like a scar, steep walls, jagged edges, and dozens of tunnel mouths dotting its flanks. Artillery and mortars had pounded it for days, but the defenders below were still alive. The U.S. command knew what that meant. The only way to clear it was with fire. At 700 hours, the order went out. Flame tanks forward. 12 Zippo Shermans, almost every operational flamethrower tank left on the island, lined up on the southern lip of the gorge. Their hulls were scorched black from weeks of combat, their nozzles stained with soot and dried napalm. They looked less like tanks and more like beasts that had been living inside the war itself. Duplantis in 431 checked the pressure gauges, all green. His crew worked silently, each man wrapped in the ritual of preparation. They had burned through tunnels, bunkers, even hillsides, but this was different. Everyone knew it. The infantry moved into position. 2 regiments of the 5th Marine Division stretched across the approach. Engineers followed, satchel charges ready. Above, Corsair fighters streaked low, strafing the gorge rim. Naval guns thundered in the distance. This wasn't a probing attack. This was annihilation. The assault began with artillery. For 15 minutes, battleships offshore hurled shells into the gorge, turning the black earth inside out. The ground shook like a living thing. And then, just as suddenly, the guns fell silent. The tanks advanced. Duplantis's world shrank to the inside of the Sherman. The driver's voice came through the intercom, tight but steady. Forward. The treads bit into the soft ash. The gorge loomed ahead, a dark mouth full of teeth. Machine guns opened from hidden slits, raking the lead elements. Mortar rounds arced down from unseen positions. But this time the Marines didn't stop to trade fire. They answered with flame. 431's nozzle ignited with a muted click. A roar followed, a pillar of fire leaping 120 yards across the ravine, slamming into a tunnel entrance like a living comet. Napalm surged inside, crawling downward. Seconds later, a secondary burst blew the steel door outward like paper. The tank advanced through the heat shimmer. Along the line, 11 other Zippos fired in near-perfect sequence. Pillars of fire licked across the gorge like the spokes of a wheel. For the first time in the battle, the Japanese underground network was being hit simultaneously from multiple angles. No escape routes, no breathing space, just fire. The effect was immediate and brutal. Flames rolled down the slopes, pooling in natural cavities. Tunnel shafts funneled the heat deep underground. Smoke geysered out of secondary vents. Inside, oxygen disappeared. Men suffocated before they ever saw an American face. Some Japanese soldiers tried to flee their tunnels. Most didn't make it far. Marine riflemen cut them down as they stumbled through the smoke, disoriented and coughing blood. A few leapt into the flames with grenades clutched to their chests, trying to take someone with them. None reached the tanks. The gorge turned into a furnace. But the enemy didn't die quietly. Anti-tank guns hidden beneath reinforced casemates opened fire. The second Zippo in the line, Tank 434, took a direct hit to the glacis plate. The crew tried to reverse, but another shell struck the fuel system. The explosion lit the sky. Even from 200 yards away, Duplantis felt the heat. No one inside survived. The loss only hardened the assault. "Keep pushing," the radio barked. "Don't give them air." The tanks advanced into the mouth of hell. Infantry followed in tight formations, sealing entrances with explosives and bulldozing ash to choke off vents. Engineers tossed satchel charges into shafts glowing with heat. Each explosion echoed like a heartbeat through the gorge. A Japanese counterattack erupted from a lateral tunnel, 40 soldiers charging uphill in a desperate Banzai assault. It was the kind of attack Suribachi had forbidden early in the campaign, but desperation overruled discipline now. They ran through smoke and flame, some already burning, rifles raised. 2 Zippos swiveled their nozzles downslope and fired. The wave of flame met the charging men mid-slope. The assault vanished in a single, blinding roar. In the command post above the gorge, an officer watching through binoculars muttered, "It's not a battle anymore. It's incineration." Hours passed. The tanks rotated in and out to conserve fuel and avoid overheating. Each burst of flame consumed gallons of napalm, and the gorge drank it like a bottomless pit. By noon, the ravine was unrecognizable, a black, smoking scar littered with twisted metal and collapsed entrances. The Japanese resistance had been shredded. There were no organized counterattacks left, only scattered gunfire from dying positions. At 1500 hours, engineers reported that the primary tunnel complex had collapsed. The fortress beneath the gorge was no longer a labyrinth. It was a tomb. The Marines held the ground, but no one celebrated. The price was high. 3 Zippos destroyed, dozens of infantry killed or wounded, and below their boots hundreds of enemy soldiers lay entombed in darkness, their fortress burned from the inside out. Duplantis climbed out of 431 that evening and sat on the edge of the tank. The ash was still warm beneath his boots. Smoke curled up from the gorge like breath from a dying giant. Around him, Marines worked in silence, laying charges, sealing holes, dragging the wounded away. He didn't feel victory. He felt the weight of what they had done. Iwo Jima was almost broken, but so were the men who broke it. The gorge burned for 2 days after the last flame burst. Smoke curled up through collapsed shafts, carrying with it the last breath of Suribachi's fortress. And then, for the first time in 5 weeks, the island began to go quiet. By late March, organized Japanese resistance was gone. What remained were pockets, scattered defenders living in the dark, crawling through half-collapsed tunnels, emerging only to die. Suribachi himself was presumed dead, likely fallen in a final skirmish near the North Plateau. His soldiers had obeyed his orders to the end. None of them surrendered. For the Marines, the war on Iwo Jima did not end with a single moment of victory. It ended with silence, a silence that hung heavy over the black ash like fog. Tank 431 rolled slowly across ground that only weeks earlier had been a killing field. Its hull was scorched, pitted with shrapnel, the paint burned away in streaks. But it was still moving, a survivor among machines. Duplantis and his crew rode in silence, eyes scanning a landscape that felt less like a battlefield and more like the surface of some scorched moon. The sounds of the battle were fading now. No artillery, no mortars, just the crunch of boots in ash, the idle hum of engines, and the occasional distant crack of a rifle as Marines cleared the last scattered holdouts. The island that had once roared like a furnace now whispered. They passed what had been the Japanese command complex, a shattered labyrinth buried beneath tons of collapsed rock. Engineers had poured flame and explosives into it days earlier. Nothing stirred. The defenders below had fought to the last breath. Most never saw daylight again. A Marine corporal walking beside the tank muttered, "We burned a whole army underground." No one answered. There was nothing left to say. The human cost of that victory was everywhere. More than 6,800 Americans were dead, nearly 20,000 wounded. Among the Japanese, out of roughly 21,000 defenders, fewer than 300 had been taken alive, most of them too wounded to resist. The rest were ash and silence. The flamethrower tanks had played a decisive role. Their bursts had cracked fortresses, burned out tunnels, suffocated entire units. They'd shortened battles that might have cost twice as many lives, but they had also left scars, not just on the island, but on the men who used them. Tank crews rarely talked about what happened underground after a flame burst. They didn't have to. The smell was enough. The heat that radiated back through the nozzle. The way the screams came all at once and then stopped like a switch had been flipped. It wasn't like shooting a gun. It was something closer to opening a door into hell. Duplantis sat on the hull of 431 that night, helmet off, boots in the ash. Around him, the island glowed faintly under the moonlight. The silhouette of Mount Suribachi loomed in the distance, its flag still fluttering above the peak. That flag had gone up weeks earlier, but the battle had kept going long after the famous photograph. Only now was it truly over. The Marines built temporary cemeteries along the beach. Row after row of white crosses appeared in the black sand, each one marking a name, a hometown, a silence that would follow families for generations. Trucks carried the wounded to aid stations. Engineers bulldozed the collapsed tunnel mouths, burying the Japanese dead where they had fought. No surrender, no speeches, just the slow, methodical work of ending a war. The final flamethrower tank missions were not assaults, they were clearing operations. Instead of charging into fire, the tanks were used to burn out the last sealed chambers, ensuring no surprise counterattacks in the night. The crews fired not at enemies, but at the memory of them. Fire became the punctuation at the end of a sentence written in blood. In one of the last operations of the campaign, 431 fired its final burst into a shaft near the northern plateau. The napalm rolled downward into a void. No shots came back. There were no defenders left to fight. The sound of the fuel pump winding down felt louder than the flame itself. When the island fell completely under American control on March 26, the Marines didn't cheer. There was no parade, no triumphant speeches, just tired men sitting on black sand, staring at the horizon. In the official reports, the operation was marked as a success, Iwo Jima secured. In the memories of the men who fought there, the word was heavier than that. It was a victory measured in silence, in burned-out tunnels, in the empty space where voices used to be. The flamethrower tanks were to be shipped onward. Another island waited Okinawa, another fortress to burn. For now they rested. Mechanics cleaned the soot from their hulls. Crews wrote letters home, carefully avoiding the things they'd actually seen. Duplantis scribbled one line in his notebook that night. He didn't write about fire or victory or the gorge, just 5 quiet words. The island finally stopped screaming. Iwo Jima had fallen, but no one who burned it out would ever forget the sound. The last flames on Iwo Jima went out, but the echoes they left behind did not fade with the smoke. The lessons carved into that island of ash traveled across the Pacific like invisible shrapnel, embedding themselves in the very bones of military doctrine. Fire had not just burned a fortress. It had rewritten the way war would be fought. Even before the last tunnels were sealed, U.S. commanders were dissecting the battle with clinical precision. Artillery and bombs had failed to neutralize Iwo Jima's underground defenses. It was the Zippos, the POA-CWS H-1 flamethrower Shermans, that had turned the tide. Reports filed from frontline units described their effect with stark clarity. Flame tanks decisive. Recommend increased production and tactical integration for future operations. Those words would define the next campaign, Okinawa. The battle for Okinawa would be even bloodier than Iwo Jima. The island was larger, more populated, and even more fortified. Kuribayashi's lessons hadn't died with him. Japanese engineers had expanded on his ideas, creating tunnel networks that made Iwo Jima look like a rehearsal. But this time, the Americans were ready. Entire assault plans were built around flamethrower tanks. Instead of being a specialty tool, they became the centerpiece of breaching operations. New units were trained specifically to work in tandem with flame vehicles. Supply lines were adjusted to prioritize napalm delivery alongside ammunition. Fire had become a logistics priority. The doctrine had evolved. What began as an improvised conversion project in a Hawaiian workshop became a formalized operational strategy. Fire first, occupy later. Infantry didn't break the lines anymore. They followed behind the flame. Psychological warfare was no longer a side effect. It was a weapon. Japanese defenders at Okinawa, hearing the roar of Zippo tanks in the distance, often broke before they saw them. Fear did what shells couldn't. One captured soldier reportedly said, "We can fight bullets. We can hide from bombs. We cannot hide from fire." But the echoes were not just tactical. They were personal. Many of the Marines who'd burned out tunnels on Iwo Jima brought those memories with them to Okinawa. The sound of the pumps, the heat radiating back through the armor, the sudden screams and silence, it stayed with them. War had a way of following men home, and fire made that weight heavier. For the Japanese high command, the impact was equally profound. Iwo Jima had been designed as the perfect fortress, a test case to bleed the invader dry. It had failed, not because the defenders lacked courage, but because their engineering could not defeat something as simple and terrible as burning gel forced under pressure. After the battle, surviving officers in Tokyo quietly revised defensive strategies, but they knew the truth. Flame had no real counter once it reached the tunnels. Kuribayashi's brilliant fortress design had been outmatched by physics. The lessons of Iwo Jima also reached beyond 1945. The psychological power of fire, how it collapses will faster than walls, became a fundamental element in future military planning. Napalm would appear again in Korea, then in Vietnam, then elsewhere, wherever fortified positions needed to be broken and enemy morale shattered. The modern world would come to associate flame not just with destruction, but with terror. For the flamethrower tank crews, their role was quietly recognized in after-action reports, but rarely celebrated in the public narratives of victory. There were no grand statues of Zippos, no triumphant headlines. Their work had been too ugly, too visceral. They hadn't stormed beaches waving flags. They had burned men in the dark. Duplantis and his crew were rotated off the island weeks after the fighting ended. The 431 was stripped down, refitted, and reassigned for Okinawa. The men went with it. They didn't talk about Iwo Jima much, not with each other, not with anyone. But in their journals, the words came out differently than the official reports. "This isn't hero stuff," one gunner wrote. "It's what happens when men dig deep and we have to burn deeper." At the strategic level, military planners began to see flame as more than a weapon of opportunity. It was a tool of certainty. It didn't rely on visibility. It didn't require perfect aim. It turned the enemy's strongest defense, their tunnels, into their tombs. By the summer of 1945, more than 500 flamethrower tanks were slated for deployment. Engineers were improving the projector system, extending the range beyond 150 yards. The Zippo had evolved from an improvised monster into an industrialized instrument of war. And yet, beneath all the charts, maps, and unit readiness reports, there was an undercurrent of unease. Officers who had walked the Black Sands understood what those statistics meant in human terms. Fire was efficient, but it was also horrifying. It was a weapon that stripped war of its last illusions of nobility. The Japanese defenders who faced it rarely broke in organized ways. They broke as individuals, alone, choking, burning in the dark. On Okinawa, the stories spread faster than the tanks themselves. Some garrisons abandoned positions without firing a shot. Others dug deeper, knowing what awaited them if the Americans arrived. In Washington, the success of the flamethrower campaign fed into another conversation already underway: the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands. If fire could break fortresses on tiny islands, what would happen in cities, in factories, in tunnels beneath Tokyo? It was a question no one wanted to answer out loud. Iwo Jima was small, but its lessons were huge. They echoed through Okinawa, through post-war doctrine, through the psychological understanding of what warfare could become when technology and terror were woven together. In the official Marine Corps archives, one line in an operation summary stands out: "The enemy was buried in fortresses of their own making. Fire was the only language those fortresses understood." That was Iwo Jima's legacy, not just a battle won, but a method born. A method that would shape war long after the Black Sand cooled. When the guns fell silent on Iwo Jima, the battle didn't end. It simply moved inward into the minds of those who had survived it. History remembers battles in maps and numbers, in flags and victory dates. But the men who lived them remember in flashes: the smell of scorched earth, the hiss of a tank pump, the sudden silence after the flame. For Sergeant Thomas Duplantis and the crew of Tank 431, the war moved on to Okinawa. But Iwo Jima never really left them. It lingered in the way they slept, in the sound of engines, in the faces that no longer sat beside them inside that steel shell. In the years that followed, when people spoke of the island, they spoke of Suribachi, of the flag, of the heroism on the beaches. Few spoke of what happened beneath the surface. Fewer still spoke of the fire. The flamethrower tank crews were not war heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't photographed storming ridges or raising flags. They were the ones who crawled forward into tunnels, who turned fortresses into furnaces. Their work was effective, necessary, and unspeakably hard. Many never found words to describe it. Veterans' interviews decades later were halting, quiet. "We didn't see the men we burned," one gunner said, "but we knew they were there." Another added, "You can feel it through the tank. The heat comes back at you, you know." Some survivors from the Japanese side eventually spoke too. A handful had escaped tunnel collapses or had been taken unconscious from burned positions. They described the fear, not just of death, but of dying without ever seeing the sky again. Fire had stripped away every illusion of glorious last stands. It left only choking heat and darkness. And yet beneath all the horror something else persisted, the humanity of those caught in it. On both sides, men were pushed to extremes not because they hated each other personally, but because the war demanded it. The flamethrower tank wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from a problem, a fortress that wouldn't break, and from men trying to survive inside it. As the years passed, the Zippos were scrapped or displayed in museums, their steel faded and quiet. But to the men who operated them, they were never just machines. They were both shield and burden. They had saved countless marine lives, and they had burned countless others out of existence. Duplantis lived a quiet life after the war. In his garage, an old notebook sat on a shelf, stained, tattered, and filled with the words of a young man trying to make sense of the fire. One line, written not long after the battle, read simply, "We brought the sun to men hiding in the dark." It wasn't a boast, it was a confession. In Japan, the memory of Iwo Jima settled differently. For many families, their sons vanished into tunnels that became their graves. There were no headstones, no last letters, no markers. Only the knowledge that their fortress, once thought impenetrable, became a crematorium. Yet in time, veterans from both sides began to meet, not as enemies, but as men who had stood on opposite ends of something bigger than themselves. At memorial ceremonies, they bowed not to victory or defeat, but to the dead beneath the ash. The fire that once divided them became the shared weight that united their memories. In military academies, Iwo Jima is taught as a case study in fortification and assault. Students learn about tunnel systems, flamethrower range, bunker sealing, and casualty ratios. They do not hear the screams or the silence after them. They learn the mechanics of the battle, not the cost. But for those who were there, the cost is everything. The flamethrower tanks never became icons of American victory. They were too terrifying for that. They represented the part of war no one wanted to glorify, the part where technology and fear fuse into something unstoppable. Yet without them, Iwo Jima might have cost thousands more lives. They were monsters built to fight monsters. Today, the island is quiet. Vegetation has returned in patches. Tourists and military personnel visit the memorials. The black sand still clings to boots, just as it did in 1945. Beneath the surface, the tunnels remain, a labyrinth of stone and shadow. Some are sealed. Some still breathe faint drafts of air as if remembering. At the crest of Suribachi, the flag still flies. It's a symbol of victory. But down below, buried in the volcanic earth, lies the story that flag doesn't tell. The story of men burned out of fortresses, of tanks that breathed fire, of survivors who carried the weight long after the ash cooled. Memory is not clean. It is not sharp like a metal or tidy like a photograph. It is a weight, and on Iwo Jima that weight was forged in fire. Duplantis never called himself a hero. None of the Zippo crews did. But when he returned to the island decades later, he stood at the edge of the gorge, the wind moving through the brush, and whispered, "This is where it got quiet." Not a celebration, not a curse, just memory. Iwo Jima was a story of strategy, of weapons, of fear. But above all, it was a story of men, and the fire that changed them forever.